Hey, Taylor.
Yeah, Mayor.
You need a haircut.
Yeah, it's getting shaggy. Yeah.
We all need a haircut.
Yes, right?
Mayor, we are live streaming now.
All right, I'm going to wait about one more minute here. We have 2 council members that haven't joined just yet. Now we're down to 1. So we'll just give it a minute and get started. All right, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. Call to order a public meeting pertaining to the proposed amendment of the Community Development Block Grant Citizen Participation Plan. Please call the roll.
Mayor Coos.
Here.
Mr. McCarthy.
Here.
Ms. Cummings.
Here.
Mr. Nord.
Here.
Ms. Smith.
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz.
Here.
Mr. Preston.
I think we have one public commenter in the waiting room. I think Mr. Ron Ulmer. That's the only one I'm aware of at this point. Mr. Ulmer, if you would like to make your comments.
I have just admitted Ron Ulmer.
Thank you. Mr. Ulmer, if you want to go right ahead. I think we all know who you are.
Okay. I'm going to read what the town manager, Pam Reese, said this morning. I got to get away from my computer. I'm on my phone. In today's paragraph with the headline on how to spend COVID-19 funds. The town wants to hear from the public about how to spend the $246,000 in federal funding to help combat the impact of COVID-19. My take on this is excuse me, the municipalities are receiving funds through the Department of Urban Development block grants. Let me make my comment on this. The town of Normal is required through law to solicit public input. The town does not want to hear from taxpayers. It ignores input unless the taxpayers support what the town already has decided to do. Then she goes on to say, we are required to use them on something related to coronavirus, but in a very broad way because we want to continue to be flexible in the needs to react to the needs of the community. Use of the funds in something related to the coronavirus interpretation means anything the council desires, likely to ensure that no employee is furloughed or given a pay cut. Finally, town staff is working with the city of Bloomington, which received $329,000. Why would the town staff work with Bloomington before requesting citizen input? Because it is already decided how the money will be spent. If the taxpayers were to present better uses, the councils aren't going to waste their time starting all over again on how to use the money. I'm done. Finished.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else in the waiting room wishing to speak to the proposed amendment of the Community Development Block Grant Citizen Participation Plan? Hearing none, motion for adjournment.
So moved, Kathleen.
Second.
Thank you.
Kevin.
Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy.
Aye.
Ms. Cummings.
Aye.
Mr. Nord.
Aye.
Ms. Smith.
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz.
Aye.
Mr. Preston. Mayor Coos.
Oh, here. Sorry, Mr. Preston's here.
Gotcha.
Aye, we are adjourned. call to order a public hearing pertaining to the proposed revision of the Community Development Block Grant Program 2020-2024 Consolidation Plan and Program Year 2020 and 2021 Action Plan. Please call the roll.
Mayor Kus,
Here.
Mr. McCarthy,
Here.
Ms. Cummings,
Here.
Mr. Nord,
Here.
Ms. Smith,
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz,
Here.
Mr. Preston.
Here.
Do we have anybody in the waiting room wishing to speak to the public pertaining to the proposed revision of the Community Development Block Grant Programs for 2020-2024 Consolidated Plan and Program Year 2020-2021 Action Plan? We have no one wishing to speak on that. Motion for adjournment.
Mayor Kus,
So
if I
moved.
could interrupt for a moment.
Yes.
Mr. Long, I think, had a couple of comments that he wanted to share before we adjourn the public hearing, if we could do that. Taylor, are you all set with your comments?
Yeah, sure. I just have a.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah. Thank you, Mayor and Council and City Manager Reese. Hopefully, I'll keep this as brief as possible, but just have a little presentation pulled together for you here because it's just a lot to unpack here. So I'll pull this up and share my screen, and hopefully everything will work. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Yeah, okay. All right.
Yes.
Yeah, so what we had tonight was two items related to program changes for the Community Development Block Grant Program in response to COVID-19. And so this being the second of the two, of course, and proposed revisions. So I'm just going to give you a quick bit of background. You're all familiar with our present consolidated plan and the reason we need to have it. But HUD requires that we have a 5-year and an annual action plan for the spelling out the priorities and use of CDBG funds. The one we have in place right now, the 2020-2024 consolidated plan, was drafted over the course of 2019, and if council will recall that this was approved for filing with HUD on January 21st, 2020. So in between then and now, of course, the town staff was working on wrapping up the previous 5-year consolidated plan, and right when we were about to submit this, the pandemic struck, of course. And so in response to that, the federal government passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And so as part of that, the town will be receiving an additional allocation of CDBG funds, a special allocation called CDBG CV, short for coronavirus. We'll be getting $246,067. That's in addition to our regular year allocation, which you can see noted there, for a grand total of just over $664,000 for this program year we're in right now. And so the important thing to remember with these funds is that they're to be exclusively used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus. So any activity we undertake with these has to tie back to that. So that's important to keep in mind. So, and as I said, the addition of these new funds means that we must amend actually revise this plan. It's not been submitted, so it doesn't need to be amended. So we're just revising it at this point. In addition to the types of flexibility that it gives the municipalities with regard to public participation that you just had a public hearing on, what's important about the CARES Act here is that it waives the 15% cap on public services. And so usually you'll remember that the town is limited in the amount of money that it can give to public service providers to assist in accomplishing the goals of a consolidated plan or an annual action plan. So that's about $60,000 a year. And so historically, the town, based on the priorities that it has, that are founded in a great deal, and in this case, a year's worth of public participation and stakeholder consultation, those usually go to the Unity Community Center for youth activities, and then also to PATH for homeless outreach. But in this instance, related to addressing COVID-19, that cap has been waived by HUD. And so all $246,000 in these CV funds can be distributed to service providers to help us meet our goals. And then this also applies to regular CDBG funds that go to this effort, but the municipalities are still required to work to meet the goals of the original plans that we went about the process of putting in place and soon to submit to HUD here. So in between learning of this allocations coming to the municipality, that was about a month ago. Town staff got to working with our partners, and we're lucky we have such a well-established system for working with the City of Bloomington, working with Regional Planning Commission, and through there, just a whole, it's a great conduit to a whole host of service providers here in the community. So when this happened, we were in as good a position as anyone could be, given the seriousness of this right now. So what we did was come up with the service provider survey. This, again, was with the City and Regional Planning. It was a 9-question survey available in early April. It was sent to over 70 providers. It was returned by about 25, and that's usually about the ratio you get there. And what we asked there, we asked service providers what increased needs had they seen or what calls have they been getting, requests for assistance that were related to COVID-19, and how did that compare to calls you were getting a month ago before all this struck, or at that time a month ago, or a year ago. And so from there, we also asked if funds were to become available to address a need that you serve, would you be able to staff up temporarily? So that was something we wanted to find out right there at the outset. So from that survey, it was determined based off those folks that replied to the survey that food, the general categories of food, housing, particularly rent and utility assistance, and health and mental health were the top COVID-19 related assistance requests. Additional follow-up was done in early May. We reached out to the same people again and confirmed that these were still the top three, really, the top three broad categories of assistance requests they were getting. And we've maintained weekly contact with principal service providers through a number of different, just through the process we have in place, as well as some local coalitions that have been formed. So based off of that then, and that's just a snapshot in time, things will evolve here, but from April to May, we've identified those three as priorities for the use of CDBG CV funds at this time, so that $246,000. So those top three priorities being food, housing, and health. And they're kept intentionally broad because we want to be nimble in how we address an activity that may come along, a problem that's identified in the community, and we would work to fund some kind of activity, addressing these three in the coming months. So we keep them broad so that they can be nimble, and that's something that HUD has asked us to do. So at this time, with these three priorities we have in place, town staff is proposing allocating an initial $100,000 of the 246 that's to be coming to us to address housing needs, in particular, rent and mortgage and utility bill assistance. So we would undertake this through partnerships with Mid-Central Community Action and Normal Township. Those are two organizations that are well known here in the community for providing this kind of direct assistance to homeowners, and they have a great delivery system in place that if we were to move forward in this way, we'd feel confident we could get in touch with the right people, or serve the right people. So currently, based on what we've heard from service providers, the food and health needs here in the community are being adequately addressed, and that's as of now. But staff is working to continually monitor changing priorities, and will continue to do so through the many months, or however many months this drags on. Just to continue quickly then, what we'd propose at this time is to take that remaining CDBG CV funds and just set it aside for some use down the road here. So it could be, and anything that would be done with these funds would have to come back through council through the same venue. So it could be the case that the housing assistance program is very well utilized. There's a great number of assistants that need, we exhaust that $100,000 quickly, and another amount of money could go toward that program. Some of this money could go to address either the other two priorities or other ones that come to be known here in the coming months. Aside from CDBG CV funds, we propose allocating $15,000 in regular CDBG from what was going to be the program administration budget, which there's always a fair amount of money there that gets carried over anyway, so this was a natural place to look. And what we would do is reallocate that money to for an in-home education assistance program. And that would be through partnerships with the Children's Discovery Museum and Normal Public Library. They've both got some pretty awesome programs going on right now. You've probably heard of the STEAM packets and what the Normal Library has been doing as far as books, but this would be taking funds to assist in the purchase and distribution of packets like this for in-home education during the summer months. And this would be income qualified households as well. So just an easy way to do something that would be awfully impactful here in the community. So at this time, we propose no other changes to the originally approved budget that you saw back in January. Public comment then, the proposed revised plan has been available on the town's website since May 7th. Revisions are shown in red. We're in the midst now of an 18-day comment period that'll run from, as I said, May 7th through May 24th. So after tonight, that's 6 more nights of available comment. At this time, we've received one written comment. I believe that's been forwarded along to you. We would sure like to have more. Those can be written comments can be submitted to the addresses there, my email address as well. The final draft then of the plan, including all public comment, anything that would come out of tonight's discussion or direction from council, that would be brought back to the town council for review and approval on June 1st. 2 days after then, we would have that revised plan submitted to HUD, and then HUD would have up to 45 days to approve the plan. So, and they're working as hard as they can to ensure that it doesn't take 45 days to get these funds released to the municipality. But that said, when we'd come back to you on June 1st, we would have a better idea of when folks would be able to submit applications for assistance for the different program, or in particular for the housing assistance program. And we would just have all that ironed out by the time we come back to you on June 1st in a few weeks here. So with that, we've already had public comment, of course, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mayor Cruz. And Mr. Long, I recall when you took the public input at the library and we had dots to indicate how people wanted to allocate the funds, and there was a limitation on the one dot that because of that 15% cap. I think it would be very helpful if you could refresh people's memory of the kinds of circumstances where there were ideas for that 15%, but people felt stymied by that cap, just to provide them a refresher of what falls into that category. Well, it may not apply to because it's not applicable anymore to the COVID virus situation, but I think it would help people understand how these dollars have been loosened up. And I wanted to ask whether or not you have made any effort to send out blast emails to some of the organizations, because previously when you solicited input, I know I got contacted through my SOAR mailing list, through the Penguin mailing list, and through Seedling. And with the time frame so tight, I know those organizations have a very extensive mailing list, and it would be a number of people that would probably have an interest in these funds. So I just asked whether or not you could make the effort to do that, and also whether or not hard copies might be distributed in some of the low-income apartment housing in Normal.
Sure. So I'll try to, stop me and restate your question if I forget something, but I guess I'll address your first point of publication, or just notice provided to service providers. So back when we did our initial survey, we reached out to everyone we could, those 70 plus providers. But since then, and at this point, it's just kind of been focused, and the way HUD wanted us to go about it was focus on your service providers, your people that are experts in the field of just understanding those that might be impacted by COVID-19, what are they hearing? So we focused on that first. And the point now, your point's very well taken. So we were, the town planner and I were just speaking earlier that we would tomorrow morning very likely do an email blast out to that group again. And at this time say, instead of just focusing on the calls you're receiving, like blast this out to as many people as you can, those you serve, and get their input. Just share with it and provide the means of providing public comment at this time. So do just kind of a renewed blast and focus on getting public input as we're trying to do now. So so there's that point. As far as hard copies to apartment buildings of the plan, that's something we could explore. I think the worry has been in general about the prospect of doing a hard copy survey to anyone has been just no one's wanting to use or share common surfaces of any kind right now. And then the prospect of taking things out. So, I mean, that's something, if council were to direct us, that's very much something we would do, is provide a hard copy to may do it anyway, I suppose. But take into consideration, doing that, providing the hard copies of the plan, or maybe if nothing else, just a handout hitting the highlights because it's a 300-page document. Maybe that's something that could be distributed to those folks. So, yeah.
Well, it's not so much the hard copy of the plan, but the survey. If it's possible to distribute the survey, because I'm aware that in an apartment complex on the Connect Transit line, the apartment manager there had a sign on her window that if people were coming in and out of the space or coming down to ask questions, she was encouraging them to complete that form. And it is possible to quarantine the paper copies for a period of time once you receive them. But she had quite a few people respond because that hard copy and those residents don't necessarily have internet.
Sure. And so that's something that's kind of the rub with a lot of this right now. And HUD knows this too, that a lot of the folks that are served by these funds are the same folks that don't have the best internet connection. So it's tough to do anything like this when we're all quarantined as such. But we don't have a public survey for these COVID-19 funds. The one we had is just specifically for service providers. So we would have to tweak it a little bit, but that's, I could see as things begin to loosen up, I could see real value, especially after this initial passive plan here. I could see real value in surveying just the general public and to some degree, if it's maybe we bite off select groups at a time, maybe just to start with apartment buildings or something like that. I could see real value.
Thank you.
I would posit that, reaching out to the public might be something more valuable after the June 3rd period, because as you said, you're talking to a different audience in this group. You're getting to stakeholders. And then once we start getting input on where those dollars might want to go, then we could reach out to the people that might be recipients or would have an interest in voicing an opinion. So I think there's an opportunity to do that down the road.
Okay, definitely. Okay.
Further questions? Motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Second, Kathleen.
Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy,
Aye.
Ms. Cummings,
Aye.
Mr. Nord,
Aye.
Ms. Smith,
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz.
Aye.
Mr. Preston.
Aye.
Mayor Kus.
Aye. Call to order a regular meeting for the Normal Town Council for Monday, May 18th, 2020. Please call the roll.
Mayor Kus,
Here.
Mr. McCarthy,
Here.
Ms. Cummings, Mr. Nord,
Here.
Ms. Smith,
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz,
Here.
Mr. Preston.
Here.
We'll begin with a pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, under God, with liberty and justice for all. I'm not sure if we have anybody in the waiting room for public comment on the meeting. Andrew, do we have that?
Mayor Kus, we don't have anybody else in the waiting room for public.
Thank you. We move to the omnibus agenda. Items considered routine and will be handled with one vote. Unless a council member would like to pull an item for discussion. Seeing no requests. Thank you.
I've got my hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Nord. Which item?
Item B.
Motion for approval?
Move approval.
Thank you.
Second, this is Karen.
Items on the omnibus agenda are approval of the minutes of the special meeting of May 4th, 2020, and approval of the minutes of the regular council meeting of May 4th, 2020. Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy,
Aye.
Ms. Cummings,
Aye.
Mr. Nord,
Aye.
Ms. Smith,
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz, Mr. Preston,
Aye.
Mayor Kus,
Aye. Item B is a report to receive and file town of normal expenditures for payment as of May 13th, 2020. Mr. Nord?
I so move.
I second.
Thank you. Mr. Nord?
My first question on the expense or comment is on PDF page 32, the city manager general expense, the $75,000 a month subsidy that we pay Connect. I understand that Connect is not running their full routes right now, so their expenses would I would assume that they're lower. So I would like to see that our prorated share that we pay be reduced to reflect the reduction in their expenses, because during this time, Connect shouldn't be, profiting off of this.
Mr. Nord, the motion is to report to receive and file town of normal expenditures for payment. These are payments that have already been made, to remind you. So if you have issues with those, you can bring those up with town staff, or you can bring them up in concerns, but this would not be the time to talk about issues on bills.
Well,
we're just approving or not approving the bills. That is the
all
motion.
right. This expense is going to go on next month, so I would like to have that comment out there. Then another expense that I have to move on.
A fair point. But again, if you're questioning expenses in the town of normal, the place to do that would be in council concerns, not in this motion. Go right ahead.
Okay. For public education, some folks have asked about the economic tracking software. Ms. Reese, could you talk about what that's for and what the taxpayers are going to see from that?
Well, actually, I'm going to defer to Assistant City Manager Eric Hansen, who's been working with the vendor on this. We had a demonstration of some software through Buxton, and that Buxton is an economic development consulting firm, and they focus significantly on retail. And we found their tool to be very useful, and we think it will help in our forecasting and our modeling. But I will let Mr. Hansen specifically talk about how we plan to use that tool.
Thank you, Ms. Reese. So in short, obviously, with all that's going on with the COVID-19, there's a lot of concern about the state of retail, and in terms of what's going on currently and what's going to happen going forward. Obviously, a fair amount of our general fund is supported by retail-related activities, and we have a number of major drivers in our community: Target, Home Depot, Menards, Sam's, Walmart, et cetera, that generate a fair amount of activity, not only for residents of Normal, but also attract people regionally. What the software allows us to do, and working in conjunction with finance and Mr. Hune and his staff, is give us real-time data in terms of what's occurring in the market, what's occurring in those centers, and hopefully provide us guidance to make good decisions in terms of not only where we're at financially with our budget during this time of shutdown, but also there are still retail opportunities out there that are looking for expansion in certain segments, certain market segments. And we have vacancies in the town of Normal that likely could be filled. And so hopefully we, in our ability to better track some of these systems, can provide better data to council in terms of what to expect financially over the next 3 to 6 months within that segment, but also continue our efforts to try and curtail to the extent we can any out-migration of retail and or identify opportunities to fill spaces within our respective centers and locations throughout the town. If from an investment standpoint, relative to your question about the taxpayer, making good decisions and or being able to attract even a single retailer would far generate more revenue than the cost of the service.
Okay, thank you. My only request is to share that freely with the economic development folks, because they will need that information for folks that are contacting them.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't disagree. I've always enjoyed talking with Patrick and his team.
Yeah, because there's probably data in there that people are going to ask him for that, would be nice to share. Then the last comment I have on the expenses, the cultural arts, the theater, 90% of the $4,400 in expenses is going towards advertising. My understanding is the purpose of this, these funds are to support the theater, the historic theater, but that theater people can't go to. So are we spending the money advertising people to watch movies online? That seems like we're kind of shifting from the purpose of what the funds are secured for.
Well,
Mr. Nord, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mayor.
At the risk of repeating myself, the motion is to receive and file town expenditures. It is not to discuss issues or policy in that. Bring this up again in concerns, please. Please call the roll on this. Did you have another question on the bill, Mr. Nord?
It's going to be the same type of thing, but no, it's just making sure that the expenses we're incurring are for what it was intended to be done.
I would ask you to pose thoughts until concerns, because that's not the motion we're dealing with here. Please call the roll.
Ms. Cummings? Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The motion is approved. Moving to general orders, item 7 is an ordinance to amend parking restrictions within the Park West and Greystone Field subdivisions. Thank you.
Second, this is Karen Smith.
Thank you. Discussion on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Cummings?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The ordinance is approved. Item 8 is an ordinance authorizing the undergrounding of certain utilities in Uptown Normal along East Buford Street in the alley located adjacent to the railroad from Uptown Circle to Linden Street, and award a bid to Anderson Electric.
Move approval,
Move this-
Kathleen.
Thank you.
Second.
Ms. Lorenz. Did you have a comment, Ms. Lorenz? You're on mute.
Thank you. Keep pulling my, there we go. All right. I would like to just offer up a point here for my colleagues. That in a perfect world, I think we probably all would say that, gosh, why weren't these more complicated factors concerning the utilities identified at the outset? And yeah, in a perfect world, I'm sure engineering and utility would have wanted to find that at the outset as well. They didn't. And so here we are, some 8 or 10 months later, from when it was originally presented to us late last summer. But I think that recognizing that it's not a perfect world, that they have caught it and they are coming back to us amending the project. And I think it's in a way that is consistent to have these kinds of undergrounding of the utilities in these types of projects. It's no different than many projects that have already happened in Uptown. And I think in the report, it outlined many of the benefits that will occur on that block as a result. So the money is available and eligible to be paid from the TIF fund. In fact, some money will actually be reimbursed to the TIF fund as a result of this project. I think $91,000 was the figure that will actually help offset the costs of undergrounding. And, I think this is a way to make this project even more successful. And I look forward to these local developers being successful in their endeavor.
Mr. Nord.
From my understanding, this expense of nearly $250,000, is this solely for the work for this developer to address his power issue?
Okay, yes, thank you, Mayor. No, this is to underground utilities for that entire length of the block from Linden all the way down toward the Children's Discovery Museum. But I will, of course, again, ask Mr. Hansen and Mr. Aldrich to be prepared. They have been the lead staff people on this project, but this is not a $250,000 or $249,000 expense for Fiala Brothers. This is a $249,000 expense for the entire block.
Okay, so my question is, if all we're going to do is just address the Fiala Brothers, how much does that cost? The taxpayer portion.
Okay, Mr. Hansen, would you, or Mr. Aldrich, do you want to respond to that?
I can certainly start, but I'll probably defer to Wayne since he's an engineer and I'm not. That's not just the option. There's multiple conflicts back here, both in terms of Ameren, but then also multiple utilities are involved. Frontier, Metronet. There's several utilities on the line. The lines, including Ameren, actually run over the top of the building. And so merely moving the pole after being discussed with Ameren was not a viable option given all the other conflicts in the area. And that's when we sought an alternative. To be very honest with you and with council, if there was an opportunity to just resolve this issue for the single property, that's likely where we would have went given the circumstances. But talking to Ameren and talking with all of the conflicts with the other utilities, that wasn't a viable endeavor. And so we actually sought them to solve the whole problem. But originally the focus was just on, what we hoped would be the transformer upgrade and moving a pole, and it would not have caused an issue. Obviously that's not what was initially articulated to the project. And then we got to a much more significant fix, but the benefit obviously is the utility problem for this entire stretch then is fixed, for decades to come. And so that's certainly an added benefit to this particular issue. Mr. Aldridge, do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I can. So we tried to divvy up the expenses per each property. So it's been our tradition in the past, if there's a property that was going underground, that it wasn't typically a choice of theirs to go underground or not. So there was no cost allocated to that project. So actually the Fiala projects, we didn't split it up per project. There are actually 3 properties kind of under control of Fiala Brothers, including the new brewery property. So to answer your question, as we have split the costs up, approximately $79,000 would be associated for all 3 properties under control of Fiala Brothers, with the largest amount being associated with the brewery property.
So then, how will the remaining funds be recouped from the other property owners?
Again, typically, it's been our practice in the past not to recover funds, pay for these types of improvements through TIF funds and other sources of redevelopment funds for properties that are there and go underground. So we've associated costs for the new developments and appropriate those costs to the new developments typically in the past. Whereas if a property was just existing on the block and needed to go underground, that was paid for through TIF funds and other redevelopment funds.
All right, and the recoup for this through the TIF funds, this is a $250,000 expense, and the recoup is going to be $91,000, is what the report had said. When we gave the incentive, you know, that was a part of the justification to give the initial $150,000 incentive. So from hearing this, you know, we're giving even more of an incentive. What I struggle with, you know, I don't necessarily disagree with utilities going underground. It's that we're doing more than what we need to at a time when money is so tight. And, you know, at some point, incentives that taxpayers need to give to build in Uptown or for a business to come in Uptown, at some point it becomes too expensive. And where is that point? You know, my threshold is, well, different than other people's threshold. And I just believe we've kind of passed that point. And what happens if we say no tonight? I mean, Fiala Brothers would just spend another $50,000 to have their power taken care of. Is that correct?
No, I don't. Mr. Mayor, if it's okay, I'll jump in. I don't believe that is correct, Mr. Nord. I believe the project probably won't happen because they can't just upgrade a transformer. So just a couple of notes of clarification for council. In regard to this project, the $249,000 total expense, we had indicated in the report there are two ways that there will be some offsetting money back to the TIF fund, not the full 249,000, but it will be recouping some of the investment. Approximately $91,000 from our estimate will be the growth in the EAV from the specific Fiala Brothers parcel. That growth of $91,000 goes into the TIF fund. The other dollar amount is the $26,000 that the Fiala Brothers are paying, which would be the specific costs associated with the transformer itself. So another $26,000 goes back into the project to offset the costs. So really the total investment by the TIF would be a net of $130,000 or so. My numbers may be a little bit off, it's just my recollection. So that is what we're asking for in terms of the overall investment. The other thing to note is the Fiala Brothers project, the development agreement that council adopted in 2019 does not take any advantage of the TIF increment for the project. The rebate to the Fiala Brother developers is solely a rebate of sales tax that their project is going to be generating. So it's a little bit different than other development agreements that we've had in the past.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Can you walk me through why just a taller power pole wouldn't address these issues? I mean, I've worked with Ameren on other projects, and sometimes when height's an issue, they just put in taller poles and then would be above all the buildings.
Sure, that's definitely an engineering kind of question, so I'll defer to Mr. Aldrich.
It's been my experience that that's not the case. I mean, that's not within their policy to go over buildings like that. They've certainly got restrictions as far as safety restrictions, but also accessibility and things like that. So I'm again, not to say I haven't seen that as well, because I have, but that would.
Have you had the conversation with them? I mean, has that been ruled out? Because this is a lot of money.
Yeah, we did. Actually, we had two conversations with Ameren specifically. The first conversation we had, what to do. And then the second conversation is, are there options? And so both Mr. Trummel and I had that conversation with them. And really there weren't any good options. This really is the best option to provide power and other utility services for all the properties there. So yes, we did have that conversation with them.
Okay, well, if they said there's no way, no how we can just put in taller poles, then I'm surprised if all it is the height that was the problem. But this took an incentive of $150,000 for what we were expecting to get to a to almost a $400,000 incentive. So thank you.
Ms. Cummings.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to touch a little bit on this just because I was very shocked to see that we were still using a more antiquated method of having utilities above ground. I know in conversations, as we talk about from a national perspective on expanding communications and accessibility to internet and things of that nature, one of the things that constantly come up and is usually a kind of like one of those things that's a hindrance to communities is the fact that many of them don't have poles underground. And so when you're talking about moving a community forward and being forward thinking and pushing a community towards futuristic ways of handling things, they are going underground. I did find there's a lot of information about underground utilities. The number 811, which is typically, we know it as Julie Dig, they have a lot of information, as well as Americon Technologies. And what was consistent about them both was they talked about how utility companies are pushing for underground. It's because the lines are fully protected. It saves space and significantly reduces outages. They also talked about the visual impact, which is one of the things we also kind of talked about in showing photographs of what is back there behind the buildings at this time. But it also reduces the exposure to damage and the wear and tear that can take place above ground. And they said one of the things that stuck out the most is it's less dangerous because as you continue to pile on the lines, you see some safety risks. And so for me, those are things that stick out in a space that we are continuously trying to grow and attract families to come to, to see that going underground is a less dangerous and a more safe approach to utilities. That is something certainly I can get behind.
Ms. Smith.
Thank you. I just have a need for some background understanding of, I think in some conversations and background on this, it was pointed out that the utilities are all underground for the section of Uptown. Am I correct? From the Circle over to Fell Avenue, is that an accurate statement? And I'm not sure who to direct my question to.
Typically, yeah, the most utilities in Uptown are underground, and that was a deliberate part of the Uptown project. So on every project that we built, or the street improvements or the underground infrastructure improvements, we always made effort to make sure to coordinate all the utilities, make sure they were in an appropriate location and that they were underground as well. So quite a bit of investment was made by the town to underground all the different types of utilities. Typically, it was done when we built the new projects, but in other cases, it was a coordinated effort, throughout the Uptown area. So I would say that this is one of the last blocks that doesn't have underground utilities. The other block would be behind Medici. There's a large portion of that block. And then of course the Trail East project block that we actually have proposed undergrounding utilities on that block as well with the new redevelopment.
Well, in the section of Uptown that extends from the Circle to Fell Avenue, Fell Street, there are older buildings as well as the conference center. When those utilities were put underground, how was that cost apportioned?
Typically the same way. The major portion went with the new project. So if there was a new project, whether it was the hotel or whatever other project, but the major portion was associated with the project costs. Now, for example, on the block with the Hyatt Hotel and the Uptown One, there were several properties that were undergrounded, existing buildings that were underground as well. And so again, the same sort of precedence was made and the same guideline was applied, where the new project paid their portion, which was the majority of the cost, and then the other costs associated with the other individual properties where no improvements were being made associated with that was borne by the TIF funds or other redevelopment funds by the town.
And so when these wires go underground and it's moving from Linden over to basically the plaza, so it will be serving business owners besides the Fiala brothers. Is that an accurate statement?
That's correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. McCarthy.
Well, waiting to the end always gets most of my questions asked for me. So,
you're not
Ms. Reese cleared up most of the financial incentive and separations of pots and dollars clarification that I needed. Thank you for that. I did want to add one other thing. Councilperson Cummings talked about safety, and I want to touch on just a little bit of that. Is to recall that although not originally intended for the trail to go there, when we had to close that access through, that the Constitution Trail is routed right behind that section, as the greater demand and crowding for those poles with greater and greater utilities and greater number of access right away claims are being made. And we're running little kids and families through the back of that alleyway, and I'm less comfortable with the plastic barriers for the parking and increasing utility lines and services back there. I don't know if you've ever been back there when a storm's brewing, but those wires usually are flopping around quite a bit. And so all the financial stuff aside, I want to lend my support for public safety, particularly since that is a major access point to the Uptown for kids and families.
Thank you. Ms. Lorenz.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank Mr. Aldridge for underscoring a point I made earlier about kind of a precedence of how we've approached utilities in other aspects of the Uptown region. And so along those lines, I want to just clarify something, a line of narrative that I think Councilmember Nord started here with respect to the previous incentive on the sales tax rebate. I really want us to not conflate the I think it was $50,000 in the sales tax incentive that was passed in August. I do not want to conflate that with this expense of roughly $50,000 of utility improvement. It would be a nice tidy soundbite to say 150 plus 250. Oh, now the town is spending more money on this particular project, and nothing could be further from the truth. And I think that's come out in some of the information that engineering has shared, that this is not necessarily project specific, although this project is the impetus for this, but it is actually part of a larger plan that we have taken with our Uptown development. So, it would be a nice tidy soundbite to say, oh, now town is spending $400,000, and that's just simply not true. This is an investment in the quality of the infrastructure of our Uptown. It is not an incentive to the developer. It is not additional dollars, like a check being written of taxpayer dollars for $250,000. Instead, It is money that is being utilized from an investment of the tax incremental financing district. TIFs are a beast to understand. And, you know, I just really encourage, especially Mr. Nord, if you've got any concerns with TIF, to kind of, you know, either seek out information from some of your council colleagues who maybe been at this a little bit longer, or from Mr. Hansen or Mr. Hoban on kind of a TIF 101, because I think some of your earlier narrative might be conflating things that just should not be conflated. Thank you.
Mr. Preston.
Thanks, Mayor. A question, I believe, for staff, at least that's where we'll start if they are able to answer. So in our packet, it discusses that the building footprint, building footprint, it was discovered, is directly under the existing overhead power lines. To what extent? What does that mean in reality? Are the power lines going over the entirety of the building footprint, or is it going over just a portion on the end? And where I'm going with this is, did the Fiala brothers, to your knowledge, explore the opportunities to do some kind of redesign that would be able to accommodate the existing utilities as they are without compromising the project altogether?
I can answer that, Ms. Reese, if you want. So the answer to your question, Mr. Preston, is yes, they did. They went back to their architect. There's two conflicts. One is the pole actually sits in the footing, and then they are also, if you remember, Bill's Key and Lock is a one-story building. They are replacing that with a two-story building, and so from there, with the angle of the power lines that come from to the west towards Firehouse and EMAC, heading to the east towards Linden, as you know, that block kind of curves to the north, and that's where the lines actually go across the corner of his building. So there were a couple of different conflicts, and we asked very specifically, could you modify your footprint in a cost-effective fashion to alleviate this problem? They went back to their architect, and the answer was no. And certainly it could be done, but not in a cost-effective fashion.
Thank you.
Likely would have meant that the project did not go forward.
Sure, thanks. And then one further clarification from staff, though we are talking further east in this stretch, is there anything with undergrounding these utilities that could potentially have an impact on any kind of future underpass conversation or activity, to where we'll be doing, if that underpass does go forward, that we would be doing the same work twice?
Mr. Aldrich?
Yeah, I think that's further west. Now, that the underpass project has a whole different set of utility issues, but really not related to this undergrounding here. There will be some power utility involvement that we've learned from Ameren, as they have told us they anticipate doing some improvements south of the tracks. And there are fiber optic lines and communication lines of that type on the railroad right of way. So those are the primary concerns with the underpass. Not to say that there won't be some relocation of some power lines very near to the museum and some of the power going out to the circle, because there will be some relocation of those lines as well, but they're currently underground.
Okay, but there should be no impact on the stretch that we are talking now that is further east of that area.
The only impact I can see is a temporary impact, is power may have to, be, because one of the transformers behind the museum provides power to some of these buildings on the block of East Buford as well as the circle. So there could be some impact as far as power outages, things like that, as we go forward with the underpass project.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Mr. Nord.
Thank you. Mr. Aldrich had talked about how whenever a business went in and built, what I got from the conversation was whoever was the furthest one along. basically needed to pay the lion's share, and then we undergrounded all the utilities. Well, in this area, the CDM is at the end of this run. Theirs are undergrounded. Then you've got EMAC and Bolio's, theirs is undergrounded. Then you keep going east, Firehouse Pizza is undergrounded. And then the rest are all above. So we've had 3 opportunities to do this and we didn't. Not that I'm saying it's bad to put stuff underground. I do think that that is good, but what I think we've done is we've set the precedence in Uptown for developers. We've rung the dinner bell and demonstrated that if your costs go over what you expected, Norma will step up and cover that. And that, I think, is unfortunate because I don't believe that we cover overages for developers anywhere outside of Uptown if they get into a project and find that it's going to cost more than what they originally anticipated. And that's the precedence that really scares me. Thank you.
Mr. McCarthy.
Sure. I guess I've got a little different take on that. And I think the precedent that clearly the town has set since the late 90s and early 2000s when the initiation of really the whole Uptown redevelopment is that Normal's willing to invest in infrastructure to make sure that there's a great place for people to locate their businesses and that they won't have to worry about that sort of thing. And, you know, maybe we could have or should have done this sooner, maybe, but here we are today and here's the nature of the problem. So I think really the success of Uptown has really been about a bunch of infrastructure investment. Frankly, I remember standing on the sidewalks in front of the coffee house when the streets were dug down. I don't know how many feet that was, Mr. Aldridge. I'm sure could tell me 8, 10, 12 feet and all that is going on. And what that's done is paved the way, running some internet beside the north side of Beaufort, at least enabled one startup business that required some high-speed internet to exist. Sadly, they didn't last, but that's part of it. But I think the good president of us meaning us now and the councils before us, investing in the infrastructure so businesses can come in and make the investment in their business and not do a bunch of groundwork and fix a bunch of stuff that isn't there is part of the contract that we do and part of an economic incentive package that makes sense. A municipality invests in its infrastructure so businesses can invest in their businesses. I think it's been a great plan and a great strategy that's worked out well for us. So I'm supportive.
Ms. Smith.
Thank you. And this is a question that perhaps Mr. Aldridge is best equipped to answer it. Is there a distinction between the kind of utilities that were on the pole above Fialo and the utilities serving the other residents of that block? Because I've heard the words transformer bandied about, and I've seen the pictures of the pole above Fialo, and it seems to be quite loaded with wiring. So is there a distinction between what is servicing that pole and what was put underground for the Children's Discovery Museum and EMAC and Bolio, if those are already underground?
I would say the distinction is just the power service level. And so primarily there's power service lines and then there's communication lines of various types. So the distinction really is the power service requirements. So because of a new redevelopment, they'll probably need different types of transformers and things like that. So that was a major difference here, if that answers your question. The museum itself had its own power requirements. And really in this case, it's the brewery that has the highest power requirements, but the new transformer and the total system provides for the brewery and all the other properties along the block.
But the lines that were on that pole that are being displaced by putting them underground, in my limited experience with electrical providers, that they have a requirement that certain connections happen at specific geographic locations. So was there a conjunction of service lines at that pole that complicates this service to Fiala?
I think the complication is that there's lines coming, utilities coming from different directions. I think 3 of the 4 communication lines are coming from the east, from Linden Street and Frontier, and the power is coming from the west. So that's a particular complication that we didn't see in other blocks. But again, all the utilities that provide service from pretty much EMAC and Bolio's to the east are overhead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I will say, I think Mr. McCarthy hit it pretty strongly. It's always been, whether it's Uptown or throughout the community, a major infrastructure upgrade is warranted to spur development in our community. We're certainly willing to take that path. And I certainly disagree with you, Mr. Nord, that we're sending a message to the development community that if they need more money, they just come to us and knock on the door. Again, we're trying to provide an environment that promotes business in our community. It is not anti-business by saying, sorry, Mr. Developer or Mr. Small Businessman, we don't have any interest in helping you in this project because it's going to cost some dollars. That's never been our position, and that's not where we're going forward on this. Please call the roll.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz? Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Nay.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The ordinance is approved, and I would ask Mr. Nord and Mr. McCarthy to lower your hand raised there as we go to the next item. Item 9 is an ordinance authorizing boundary modifications to the area known as the Bloomington Normal Enterprise Zone, and this is having to do with the Ferraro plant expansion in Bloomington.
Move approval.
Thank you. Is there questions or comments on that? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz? Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The ordinance is approved. Item 10 is a resolution to accept bids and award a contract to Rowe Construction Company, a division of United Contractors Midwest Incorporated, in the amount of $1,535,647.15 for the 2020 motor fuel tax street resurfacing project.
Move approval.
Thank you. Is there comments or questions on this? Please call the roll.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz? Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. We have 2 items of new business tonight. The first is a presentation on COVID-19 community impact and response, and that's coming from PATH, and we have Karen Zangerly here to give us a little update on that.
Can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
Good. That's great. All right. Well, it's been a busy 6 to 7 weeks here in the land of COVID. Our calls, as you would imagine, being a 24/7 service, has seen big spikes. I hate to use very many statistics, but there's a couple that'll give you a sense of the enormity of what we're looking at. Last year, between mid-March to April 1st, we handled 344 calls about housing. This same period in 2020, we received 1,277. Another interesting point was our information services, people who are calling for information about specific things. In 2019, we got 484 calls on that, and that jumped up to 2,052 as everybody wanted to know every little detail about the COVID response. We're really lucky to live in a community where we work together to try to meet the needs. I'm here speaking, talking for PATH, but there are community people involved in the process of figuring out how to distribute money to people who are most in need. And as it was said earlier by Mr. Long, that we're focusing on housing, which is utility and rent. We think that, and I won't take the steam out of Dave's sale on the food. I'll leave that to him to talk about. But we're hearing from people who have never had to call before for assistance. And I think it's very hard for them to do so. Because for the first time, I have high numbers of calls of people who need mortgage payment assistance. Generally, we're looking at folks who can't make a next month rent with about 2 months of being off of work. This is having its effect on different layers of the community. There is, as was discussed earlier, tremendous need to get the word out about what's available. And I will tell you, there's a marketing plan in place, or it's being developed so that everyone throughout the community knows where to turn to find the assistance that they might need. Are we going to have enough assistance for everybody in need? No. So we have to prioritize, but one thing that is good with the money coming from the 2.1 trillion package from Washington is it allows us to serve more people. So rather than being at 100% of poverty level, we can now go up to 200% of poverty level, and in some cases even higher than that. The agencies are all working together really well, and there's been some forms developed that'll help us in data collection. There are things besides housing, though, that are necessary, and I think a big item is going to be childcare. As people get to go back to work, they're not going to have the money possibly to pay that childcare until they get back into the swing of getting a monthly paycheck. Our special population here are people who are experiencing homelessness. And there's been a lot of talk about this throughout the community. So I wanted to just touch on it briefly. In some places, like Alameda County, and that's the county that San Francisco is in, they received millions of dollars for the local social service providers to entirely rent 2 full hotels and to move people from the shelters into their each individual room. I am so glad they have those resources. We do not. The same money that gave them 2 hotels, they also did that in Chicago. But for us here in Central Illinois, because we're a small community and our population of people experiencing homelessness is around 200, as opposed to San Francisco, which is around 9,000. And the fact that we generate more income. And so those are the things they look at when they start tossing dollars around. So what we decided was definitely take the advice of sheltering in place. And I'm very proud of both of our shelters, Home Sweet Home and Salvation Army, because they took a number of steps that not only protected the people staying there, but to keep them protected and best serve them. There were people who were not at shelters. There are people who do not qualify for shelters, sometimes for some very good reasons. PATH was the agency that went to pick up those folks, and we put them, that sheltering in place idea, into a local hotel. None of them had COVID. None of them had been exposed to COVID. We were just trying to take some of that money from the federal government, keeping them all in one place and feeding them, hopefully for about a month. That is now running out. So we're going to have some people coming back on the streets. And I think all of us are very uncertain about what the future is going to hold for us in terms of this disease and what direction that it goes into. However, again, I think we're in a great community, a community that's ready and willing to help. Day after day, we get calls. What can I do? What do you need? One thing that's been really great for the staff here is we've had several churches actually deliver lunch for them. It was really nice. But we feel optimistic in a limited way, only because we don't know which way this is going to go. And finally, I'm talking about the population who don't have homes and cannot stay to shelter. We do have 2 isolation units in reserve for a person who pops up with COVID. I would love to take any questions that you might have.
Questions for Ms. Angerly? Ms. Smith?
Yes. First of all, thank you for coming. And I'm anxious to know how you're getting the word out to people who may now qualify for services but haven't necessarily found the courage to reach out for that help. How are you trying to connect with those individuals to let them know that the resources do exist?
The group of professionals working on this, it's going to be a myriad of ways because we're looking at billboards, we're thinking about churches, we're looking at schools, anywhere we can get flyers up that say, hey, this may be available to you. You may not have qualified before, but come in and tell us what your needs are and see if we can get you qualified now. So it's it's the most important point that you're making here. If people don't know that the money's there, then what help are we really being?
Right.
Further questions from Ms. Angerly? Thank you, Karen. That was good information and up
Mr. Mayor, I had my hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Nord. Go right ahead.
Thank you for coming in and talking. One question that I'd like to ask is, there's all these different programs that are out there, and it's hard for people to decipher who they should call. Who would you recommend to be the first point of contact for someone that just needs assistance, but they don't know where to go? I mean, is there some place that they can call that then they will know all the different options and can refer them somewhere if they don't, directly meet their need?
Call 211. 211 is in about 96% of the nation. And we have 211 here in McLean County, and PATH is the provider of 211. It's a free call, 24/7 availability, and we have a huge database of services. We're kind of seen as the hub of the social service wheel because we're the ones who keep track of who's got money, what are the guidelines going to be for that. So we can talk to somebody rather than somebody who might just go to a website, but we could talk to a person who may say, I need rent money, but that 211 volunteer is going to say, well, tell me other things that are going on with you, because they may indeed qualify for other things they didn't think that they would. So 211 is not, there's only 2 states in the country that are not 100% covered by 211, Arkansas and Illinois. So it is not something that's available statewide, but we will be using that message in Bloomington Normal. Call 211.
Wow, that is fantastic. That's probably the biggest nugget that I've gleaned out of this, because that alleviates, such a huge Rolodex and problem that people have trying to know where to go. So that's great.
Thank you.
Further?
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Good night.
Item 12 is a presentation of COVID-19 community impact and response by the United Way. And then we have David Taylor and Pania Tom to present to us tonight. So who wants to start?
I'll go ahead and start here. Let me get my screen shared. Can everybody see that okay?
Uh-huh.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council, for having Pawnee and I here tonight to present a brief overview of what the community COVID response has been that we've helped to coordinate, and also to kind of talk about what some of the next steps possibly could be and what other needs we see developing, and then allow for some time for questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and kind of jump right into it. So to piggyback off of what Karen said, we know from a recent study that was completed just prior to when COVID hit that there are roughly 24,000 households in McLean County that are considered financially unstable. We also know that from that group that we refer to as ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, employed, these are people that are working, but typically are paycheck to paycheck, may be in situations where they have to make trade-offs between what they can afford versus what they need. Many of them don't have a pre-existing relationship, for example, with a social service, with a government agency, et cetera. So frequently they're not going to know where to turn. We know COVID's impacts have been very broad and deep. They're fairly unprecedented in the way it's affected everything. And what we've tried to do is work with key stakeholders to identify what those needs are. And you can see our goals and guiding principles on the screen there, as far as creating mechanisms for quick assistance, focusing on coalitions, really an eye towards leveraging existing networks and not creating new ones. Whenever possible, creating multiple benefits with the investments, and through presentations like this and weekly reports, committing to transparency in everything that we're doing. So this is kind of a snapshot overview of what some of those needs are here in McLean County, as detailed by some organizations who provided that information and background for us. You can see food, rent and utilities, as Karen had alluded to. Mental or behavioral health, it's not something that we'll get into as a part of tonight's presentation, but you can see it's also represents a significant need currently in the community. So the imminent needs that we've been focusing in on in the short run here, since COVID really started manifesting itself locally around March 13th, March 16th, that particular weekend, has been the access to food, food insecurity, as well as the unemployment piece. And I'll go into a little bit of detail of what we mean by that here in a moment. So how much have we been able to raise so far as a result of this? So through private fundraising, starting on March 16th, United Way of McLean County decided it was critical that we take quick action with this. We invested $100,000 out of our budget to start this community care fund. Since then, we've been able to raise just not quite $300,000 privately through corporate sponsors, local organizations, individual donors, et cetera. We've also been the recipient of a $100,000 grant from the Illinois COVID Relief Fund that's run by Penny Pritzker. That's Governor Pritzker's sister and the former Commerce Secretary under Obama. So all told, that's about $500,000 with which we've been able to assemble to help start addressing some of these needs. So who are some of those local businesses that have gotten involved with this? I'll just leave this on the screen for just a few moments here, just so you can see kind of the breadth of the number of local businesses that have stepped up and stepped in to assist with what's happening with COVID. You can also see too that we've had a really diverse group of local organizations that have stepped up through GoFundMe to provide some financial assistance as well, with over 200 donors and close to $20,000 raised. We've had contributions from a variety of community organizations, the Mitsubishi Foundation, Sunrise Rotary, the Funk Foundation, and others. So what do we mean by that dual purpose, or that multiple benefits? So far to date, since we launched the fund on March 16th, we've purchased over $206,000 worth of food from local restaurants, suppliers, farmers, and others. And how this translates into that dual purpose, as you can see on the screen there, is that This is cash flow for local businesses, local farmers. It translates into wages for their employees, which helps stabilize some of them. If that only stabilizes 10, 20, 50 individuals, those are still 10, 20, or 50 individuals now that aren't probably going to need some of the assistance that Karen was referring to earlier in her presentation. So it's critical that we're looking to try to create some multiple effect with these investments. Through some of that, for example, last week we served just over 9,000 what we call grab and go meals for the week of May 11th as a part of our food access efforts. So which small businesses have we been investing in? This gives you some idea of the reach with that. A wide variety we've reached out to have helped support this effort. Some of them have provided some of the meals in kind. In other cases, obviously, we've paid for those and paid for the food because our intent, obviously, is to help those local businesses and then use those meals, that food, to help support those in need. So you can see what we've spent to date, $206,000 so far. That leaves us a little over $300,000 to continue to address the food needs, but as well as some of these other needs that are starting to bubble up that Karen had alluded to and that we'll talk about here a little bit later on. Here's the impact, though, that this has created so far. So our food efforts we've titled Feeding BN and Beyond. We send a weekly report out which kind of captures that. Just in the last week, these numbers have increased from about 950 pounds of produce to just over 1,500 from local farmers. 44,000 meals last week to over 53,000, almost 54,000 now, and from 500 food boxes to over 650 food boxes. Those food boxes have been done in support and in coordination with the Tinnervin Family Foundation, Eastview Christian Church, Midwest Food Bank, to help provide boxes of staples and groceries for families that help them to have more than one meal that they can leverage at home. These are some of the current distribution partners that we've got. As you can see, it's a fairly broad range. Places of worship, traditional nonprofits that you would associate here in the community, like Western Avenue, YWCA, and others. We've worked closely. District 87, as a part of our efforts, really felt the grab and go meals were more appropriate for them than some of the other items. So that's why you see them here, but not on the previous screen around the produce piece. And Pawnee, at this point, I'll go ahead and turn this section over to you.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate you all making the time for us. What you see up here on this slide is we've assembled a diverse group of leaders across the community to help us scale our food relief efforts. The week one, when we started doing the food relief efforts, we were doing about 5,000 meals a week. We are up to more than 9,000. We wanted to make sure we created a broad reach and a stronger coalition of leaders in the community to help us scale. And you'll see several names up here, including Mercy Davison from Town of Normal, Ray Robb from Normal Township. I also want to acknowledge Taylor Long, who's been helping us out on the shelter assistance front as well. And of course, we have Pam Reese and Scott Preston on the United Way board as well. We appreciate their engagement and leadership. If you want to move to the next slide, David, I want to talk about how these needs are evolving. When we started our efforts on March 30th, we were focused solely on food. What we noticed at different food distribution centers was the lack of use of mass. And we wanted to flatten the curve and figure out a way in which we can reduce the spread. And thanks to the efforts from the advisory task force led by Deanna Frauci and people like David Hurst and Tony Coletta, we started a campaign to collect mass and distribute mass. I'm very happy to report that 4 weeks ago, we had a 20% usage rate of mass. We're close to 100% at some distribution sites. On an average, we're at 80%. I think so. We're trying to figure out ways in which we can reach these families and distribute mass. You want to go to the next slide, David? This is the social media campaign that was started to talk about the people behind the masks and what this really means. And I think the announcement from the governor also really helped, and we are well positioned to really get some of these masks out to families that need those masks too. If you want to go to the next slide, talking about evolving needs, there's a strong theme that you'll probably see is that if someone says that we have understood or know all the needs out there in the community, I think the truth could be much further than that. The paper needs in the community have actually come up in the last couple of weeks. We've partnered with Wesley United Methodist Church. Their members, led by Karen Dodlin, have started doing a paper distribution drive, giving out diapers, paper towels, toilet paper, feminine products, and diaper wipes. We've partnered with Midwest Food Bank. United Way used some of the funding to go out and buy some of these products just to ensure that we can serve more than 425 families that actually were helped on May 16th. The intent is to do this on a monthly basis through Wesley United Methodist Church. We're also trying to figure out if there are paper needs at other food distribution sites as well. Moving on to the next one, David kind of talked about these 4 critical needs that have emerged, and the graph that you saw was data that was collected by City of Bloomington, Town of Normal, and Regional Planning Commission that validated some of these needs. United Way made a decision to really provide this relief starting around March 5th-ish. We made a decision on March 16th, knowing that we were getting some early reads that things were not going well. If you move to the next slide, David, I just want to give you a pictorial of how this need has evolved and how it feels like for a family that's out there. If you think about and imagine yourself or us as a community being a ship in troubled waters. We've dealt with a 40-foot wave that came our way in food insecurity, and we're dealing with it, and we're dealing with it really well. The front end of the ship is already underwater. There are other 100-foot waves that are coming our way. Imagine that shelter assistance or shelter insecurity need could be in rental assistance, mortgage assistance like Karen talked about, or it could be in the form of utilities or car payments. And we haven't even scratched the surface on childcare assistance. People need to get back to work. They need to take care of their young people to get back to work. So childcare assistance and this looming tsunami is the way I would put it about unemployment and job insecurity. It's looming out there. We're talking about unprecedented unemployment rates of 8% to 9%. And it's going to be a huge deal for this community. And I'm not even talking about the second wave of COVID and the health insecurity that we're talking about. So I think there are emerging needs out there. Our intent is to certainly create solutions in a coalition manner with collaborating with people. We see the need for us to heal as a community, and we want to come out stronger on the other end of the pandemic. There's only one way out from this. We need to create public-private partnerships. There's a role for our government institutions. There's a role for individuals. There's a role for employers and sponsors in town. We all need to come together to face these 100-foot waves that are coming our way. If you want to go to the next slide, David, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you. Shelter assistance. I want to briefly talk about the coalition that we have formed in the last 6 weeks on the shelter assistance front. Karen Zangerly briefly talked about it. This is a big shift in the way we've been thinking about how do we provide shelter assistance. 6 core service providers that address more than 95% of the shelter assistance needs in town came together to the table. Major funders in the community who can assist with the needs are part of this coalition. I'll talk about some brief solutions that are coming out. One is we wanted to create a coordinated entry process. Mr. Nod talked about 211 and how important that is. We agree with him and everyone else that 211 is going to be a critical thought process about how do we assist families. We're also trying to create a uniform and consistent application process so that You don't make the family fill out 7 different forms to get the assistance. We're also trying to figure out how do we maximize funding that's available through townships, funding that's available through some nonprofit agencies that have access to federal grants that are available through the city governments, and philanthropic dollars that are available through foundations, churches, and organizations like United Way. How do we stretch our dollars to help families in need? And the last and the most important one is, once the solutions emerge, how do you get the solutions out to families that need to know? Do we spread awareness through landlords? Do you put up billboards, social media advertising, put up those signs up in the buses? All solutions are open. We invite feedback and input from the city council. One of the city council members recommended that we should start sharing our weekly report with all of you. I think you may have received one from us. On Friday, we'll continue to share those with you. We invite your input offline. I'll turn it back over to you, David, to wrap this up.
Sure. So, you heard Pawnee and you've heard Karen kind of talk about what success might look like. The first thing I would say is that, with one of our guiding principles being leverage existing networks, what we're doing here is not anything. We're not building something brand new. We're taking what's working and what's out there already and figuring out how you can scale it up at the community level. So when you think of something like the school food programs and the supplementation, we work to address their 2 key gaps, which were the adult or non-school age children in the household, that meal for them, as well as the evening meal for everyone. And we take that same approach when it comes to each of these other key needs too. We've talked about shelter a little bit. We're looking at childcare assistance and how we're going to create these integrated and coordinated approaches across these various needs and across these various stakeholders is we really have to start from a mindset of whether a pre-COVID method or response is really still relevant in a post-COVID reality. Because there are a lot of ways which we've addressed some needs and some situations that would work pre-COVID that aren't going to work now. A great example is, childcare. If you're restricted on how many people or how many kids you can have in one particular place, and they, probably aren't going to social distance. For those of you who have kids, that, or keep their masks on. How do you, evaluate that demand that's going to be there with the actual supply that's available? And so we've got to start thinking from an innovative mindset and a creative mindset to address things that are new realities post-COVID. But that's going to require us to stay out of silos. Many of these situations, a family or an individual or a household that's in need probably is needing more than one support mechanism. You heard Karen allude to that sometimes if somebody calls in asking specifically about rental assistance, maybe there's some other needs. So we've got to really think through this holistically and identify what is it besides rental assistance that they might need. How do we get them back on the path to sustainability and self-reliance? And then finally, put yourself in their shoes. What can we do from those of us that have either funds available or resources, et cetera? How do we think through this? Like if you're somebody who's never had to reach out and find this help before, how do we help them navigate through this in a way that helps them to get back on their feet and gets them moving in the right direction after COVID has completely disrupted their lives? So how can you help? One, obviously help us recruit collaborators, resources, help us identify those that do have needs or maybe areas or gaps that we've overlooked. We're trying to, with things like the task force and other mechanisms, help elevate things to the community level, help get people thinking bigger than just our individual organizations. And it's going to take all of us pulling together in order to be able to do this effectively. With the grab and go lunches, that's a coordinated effort with the Chamber of Commerce, for example, where they helped identify the restaurants and help streamline that process so that we could get that moving. That was essentially stood up over a weekend. We were called on late in the afternoon on a Friday at the end of March, and there was a great grassroots effort called Feed Below No Kids that had started on Facebook and had kind of reached its outer limit as it related to their funds available as well as their volunteers and infrastructure. And so between Friday night and Monday, we had arranged 5,000 meals a week from 3,300 that they were doing previously. But we didn't do it by ourselves. We did it in coordination with others. So we're not here to ask for money. We're here to ask for support in whatever ways that you see fit in helping us do this together as a community. Here's just a few last things. You know, obviously you can catch information on this through our website. On there, we have a couple of pages dedicated to COVID resources from a social services perspective that might be of assistance. There's also a way to donate online as well through that website that can help support our efforts in an ongoing manner. We host virtual town halls every Saturday through Zoom. If you'd like to, you can reach out and we'll provide you the link to that so you can continue to get updates. And we also send out a weekly report that lets people know what the status is of what we've been doing, what impact we've been having, and what else we need to keep doing and focusing in on. So finally, as Pawnee had alluded to, but it doesn't hurt to reemphasize this, we're all in this together. COVID is affecting our entire community. We're not going to get through it by going alone. We're going to get through this by working together, whether we're public-private partnerships or in whatever manner possible. We have to really pull in the same direction to get through this effectively and come out stronger on the other side as a community. So with that, I will turn it back over to Mayor Coos and let you guys see if you have any questions for us.
Thanks, Dave. Pawnee, that was a great update. You're doing incredible work in such a short period of time. You should be congratulated for really taking this on in a positive, strong way. And so our thanks to you for that. Questions for the gentleman here? Let me see here. I got to pull this back up again. Mr. North.
Thank you guys for that presentation. That was very educational. A couple questions, or actually a comment. I think it's fantastic that United Way is able to be more flexible and nimble than what like a governmental organization can do, because you alluded to you evaluate and change methods pre-post COVID, and that's difficult for a government organization to do. So, you know, I kind of applaud you for being able to do that and recognizing that. Another thing that I really like is instead of just giving people food or money, you have coordinated with our local businesses to be able to actually make that food. So you're kind of doing a dual purpose and employing people that likely otherwise would not be employed because, you know, there's just not that much demand. And you know, your ability, I know United Way is a small organization here locally, and your ability to coordinate and put these existing groups together to meet a need is something that I don't think United Way gets as much credit as they deserve. So thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
Mr. McCarthy.
Yeah, just a couple quick comments. Dave and Pawnee, thanks for all you're doing for the community, bringing groups together and thinking outside the box and all this. And so I just first wanted to say thank you for coming and updating us and all the work that you're doing. And also to give you a plug to say United Way is doing other things besides what Dave and Pawnee is talking about. There's some break-off committees that are doing things during all this time that needs are being identified just because of this shelter in place, like rural broadband connections for kids who don't have access to e-learning, and involved with the committee that's spun out trying to solve that problem in short order. And so there's a number of United Way initiatives that are out there that they're trying to leverage existing networks and resources like you guys outlined. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that there's more than what they've just presented. And we really appreciate all you're doing to try to help out the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
That seems to be it. Thank you, gentlemen, for the great work. And of course, the town will do whatever it can to help move along your efforts. They're certainly needed, they're welcomed, and you're doing such a great job with it. So thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate you having us.
Thanks for your time. Have a good one.
Before taking a motion for adjournment, are there comments or concerns? And I need Mr. Nord and Mr. McCarthy to lower your hands and then raise it again if you've got it. Thank you. Ms. Cummings.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I really want to, I wanted to reserve this time specifically to thank you to Karen, David, and Pani for their presentation and just the work that both organizations are doing in the community, you know, to keep us going and keep us moving. And, you know, also to continue to be inspired. And I agree with what both David and Pani was saying about how we need to do this together. I think to, you know, talking about this, I really have been highly inundated with some information or emails and phone calls that I kind of want to address if I may have the privilege to. I wanted to be on record of saying where I stand on some things and what has really taken place. You know, I love this community and I want nothing but to see it thrive and certainly be at its best at all times. You know, we are facing what will become the new normal because we won't go back to what we used to know. I think there's a false perception that we'll go back to something that we once knew, and that will not be the case. One of the things is if we strike to move too quickly and our residents' fears are not assuaged, that does not mean that things will see a rebound immediately. I know with the consistent ask or constant ask to reopen, that is something certainly of a concern because many people still have fears about what is to come and what we are sitting in today. The McKinsey Quarterly went over some things about where we are in an article, and they specifically talked about, you know, businesses and that moving forward, we will see more online usage and less face-to-face. And businesses that have depended on face-to-face will not survive even post-COVID-19. They went on to say that in determining reopening and pushing to be open, that you must have a sound healthcare system in place. This means the ability to be able to detect and respond to the virus. When they mention detect and response, they also call out disease surveillance, contact tracing, and testing. I think with that being a constant discussion, and McKinsey Quarterly is really a business magazine, if you will, on they talk about a myriad of things. And so I read them on a regular, and for them to have that perspective, it continues to stick out with me. For me personally, knowing that the impact and implications on lives, I understand hard times. I've lived most of my life in hard times. So I'm very familiar. I lost my job in 2008 during the economic downturn. So I understand what that feels like. It took me 5 months to even get rehired, and I was almost homeless. So I do know what that feels like when you're uncertain and uncertainty hits. But I also know how valuable a life is. And until we have a little bit more surety, you know, I reserve to be quick to some things. Can we do some things that are more reasonable? And I think are certainly in line with what is already seemed to be acceptable. I think we're already doing that. I think it will take us all working together and people being creative going forward. I also have concerns about health, because those who impacted the most are those with no health insurance or very little health insurance. And those typically hit those who are poor, low income, moderate income, or lower middle income. So those are the things that stick on my mind. And until we can have some assurance to just say all is well, I, hold in the space. The other thing is I encourage people, I hate to go out, first of all, but there are things that still need to be taken care of. And I see more people not wearing masks than people wearing masks. And I think we've talked about this before on the safety of it, making sure that you're not only protecting yourself, but you're protecting others. So I encourage you to do so. If you don't want to wear a mask, I would then implore you to possibly stay home, find other methods by doing online in order to continue to keep one another safe, and also continue to practice social distancing. I've seen very few people actually pay attention to social distancing. And so, especially when you're in a public place, make sure that you are giving space to your neighbor for safety and security. We'll get through this together. Be optimistic and not pessimistic. And I promise you we'll make it through, and we will come and rise above all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mayor Coos. I want to echo some of the comments Ms. Cummings made. I too do get concerned when I see people in public spaces where they're not practicing social distancing and they're not wearing masks. It's unfortunate that not wearing a mask has become a political statement instead of a recognition of a health stipulation. I think out of respect to the healthcare workers who are putting their lives on the line to care for individuals with a highly contagious respiratory disease, we owe it to those workers and their families to honor the social contract that says we look out for each other by following what are known sound healthcare practices. I do know that businesses are frustrated, especially the restaurants, because the delivery service is really not sufficient to provide them with a level of income in order to cover all of their expenses. But neither would it be possible for them to, even if restaurants were opened for in restaurant dining, if a limitation is of 25% or 50% seating. I sent out an email to other members of the council about whether or not we could discuss loosening up standards for the summer to allow for outdoor seating for restaurants in normal. But I also recognize that it's important for us to develop a plan in conjunction with Bloomington, because when we do that, and we have many options available in both of our communities, we lessen the risk that there would be a surge of individuals coming to one community or the other who would violate the social distancing rules. So it does require some advanced planning, some coordination, and it also requires us to have an appropriate plan in place as we petition the governor to loosen his standard of 28-day as opposed to 14-day. And I think that is something that we need to be looking at and outlining something and coordinating a program that could work, but it only works for the businesses if everybody who chooses to patronize those businesses will honor the social distancing and the wearing mask, because it does not do us any good to have businesses reopen if patrons are concerned about their health by going to those businesses or restaurants.
I think it's a good point that you make there, Ms. Smith. I spoke with a restaurant owner today, and he made the similar plea to us. And he thought with rigid social distancing, which he realized is very important, his current outdoor patio space and possibly spilling into his parking lot, he thought that he could recoup most of his business in this transitional period of COVID-19 that we're dealing with. So I think it's something we can explore, and I certainly will have a conversation with the city of Bloomington. I'm sure they're thinking along the same lines, so a coordinated effort is certainly a good idea. Thank you. Mr. Nord.
Thank you. I'm glad that Ms. Cumming brought up the business article, because that kind of segues into the business article that I was going to talk about. Logistics is something that I follow closely just because of the industry that I'm in. And one of the trends that is now getting a lot of talk is in the fulfillment in the fulfillment network. So like your Amazon distribution centers and other distribution centers like that. Some of these distribution centers were set up in communities that either were very densely populated, or their municipalities had closed them down or restricted the items that they could sell. They're just putting them in a box and shipping them out. Well, they lost a lot of business because they weren't able to operate because of these restrictions. So now what the talk is they're rethinking their business model and instead of these big distribution centers, going to smaller ones that are more diversified, and they don't and they're not as prone to being shut down, because this closing is probably going to happen again. And so now they may be stepping outside of these big areas, going to smaller suburbs or places like that may not close them down as easily. Well, in Bloomington Normal, we are like perfectly situated logistically in central Illinois. So for a business that just needs to be somewhere in central Illinois, they're going to look at what's our reputation for being business friendly, or what's our reputation for shutting businesses down or stepping up for businesses in the event of the next pandemic. So we need to look at our reputation, because how we act now is going to be a long-term reputation we're going to have. And if other communities around us allow their businesses to reopen, you can be assured that their economic development conversations, when a business comes in, they're going to point out, hey, McLean County or Bloomington or Normal did not allow their businesses to reopen. And that will then give them an advantage to attract these businesses, because in logistics, 30 miles one way or the other isn't anything for them. And they're not coming to sell to our population. They're coming because of where we are located logistically. So I just want us to think about that. And this whole pandemic, it did start as flattening the curve, and it's turned in Illinois into an eradication effort. We need to look outside of our silo here in Normal and look what's going on through the entire nation and the globe, and see what they're experiencing, and kind of look at things through a lens that's a little bit bigger. The county is going to be talking about supporting a more aggressive reopening plan. And this is a regional plan, so it's going to involve lots of counties around us. You are much stronger if you do things together rather than going alone at it. And, in the area we're at, we're kind of behind the trend. So if something pops up, we're going to see this in other parts of the country. And, we're not going to be on the bleeding edge. So that's one benefit that we have. But of course, any plan has got to be responsible. There are these social distancing. We can't just open up the door and say, you can do whatever you want. That's not being responsible. I haven't heard a business say that they wanted to do that either. And it does need to be voluntary, because there are people that are afraid, that do have fears, or, that really are in this high risk group, and they should take precautions. But, there's always been people that have been high risk for other things. They may have severe allergies that they can't go out during a particular season, or shellfish allergies, so we always have that. It's not just this pandemic that means people need to be responsible. And it is unfair that some of our businesses that are not allowed to open, they sell the same items that you can buy at our local box stores. So that's not quite right. If these businesses can meet the same restrictions that allow the big box stores to be open, then we should allow them to open. And if they don't meet those standards, then the health department can come in and close them down as well. None of that has changed. I'm glad that United Way was here and PATH, because getting our businesses back open allows people to go out and work. It allows them to go from, being in the, I believe Mr. Taylor called it Alice, in that type of group, the folks that are not used to dealing with the social services, it lets them get back to earning an income, and the job insecurity that's out there, it starts to address that as well. And there is a huge strain on our social services. So opening things up then alleviates a lot of that. For anybody else that's watching, if you do have an opinion, contact your county board representative and talk with them, because they're voting on this week. Thank you.
Further comments? Mr. McCarthy?
Thanks, Mayor. Just a couple of things. Thanks again to PATH and United Way for coming and giving us the update. I think I'm talking with people weekly, neighbors, and I think there's an assumption that because we're elected, we sit on this board, that somehow we know all of the information that's going on and all the things that are happening. So I think it's really great that we're getting these opportunities from these agencies that are on much more on the front line than we are. I also wanted to take a second to thank staff as I've run into some of these efforts going on around the community and serving on a couple of them. Generally speaking, the town staff are involved, and I know you, Ms. Reese, are working weekly, if not daily, with our governmental partners on response and investigating options and opportunities, and serving on some of these boards to plan jointly, certainly, but try to creatively meet some of these needs, because I think Mr. Taylor's right that our pre-COVID answers aren't good answers right now. So I appreciate all that staff is doing, going beyond what we typically think about as governance, right? As making sure services are happening and all those normal things, no pun intended, but that you guys are out there serving in different and creative ways and giving of yourself and your time and energy to try to make it work all the way around the community, that really bringing together part. Just a couple of comments generally about some of the comments I've heard so far. I think it's good that we're not on the bleeding edge of this. We are in a position in Illinois to watch some other states and what's happening. And, certainly there's the debate about how aggressively to or not to open. But what we're also seeing in states like Florida and Arizona is that we also have a public confidence problem. And a vast majority of what we're seeing in those where businesses are opening up is the public is not confident enough in those regions yet to wide scale go to the businesses that are open. And that presents a different set of risk problems for our local businesses. And I think that goes back to some of our public health information. And a comment I made last council meeting is that the maintenance of a testing center here, a robust testing capacity here that's available to the mass public is very critical as we go to help support our businesses open up in whatever we can, however fast or whatever plan that we can. And I certainly am happy to engage in the conversation about public space usage for businesses and the like that Ms. Smith brought up earlier. And I've had that conversation with a couple of medical professionals here. And their response consistently is contact tracing, which we do not have a capacity here for yet. And I know that's also part of the governor's plan, but also needs to be part of everybody's plan. And I've talked to a number of business owners now, and they all seem very reasonable about phased-in approaches and safe guidelines and the like. And all of that, again, is dependent upon those two things: robust testing capacity and contact tracing. And so as we move closer to those things, I'm going to encourage our staff and all of us to think about how do we, from the town of Normal perspective, support those things and get behind whatever we can, our state representatives and the like, to continue to keep a testing capacity here in our community available so that we can give the public confidence that when our businesses start to open, that it is safe and okay to go out. Because it's not just government regulation, it is a confidence problem. And we need to do whatever we can to help solve that. I guess I just want an overall comment and then actually a thank you to what's going on with everybody here. I assume all of you are like me, that are getting emails and phone calls and having conversations when you're out. And I was out on a typical run for me the other day and got stopped 4 times on my run course, socially distanced, of course, that citizens wanted to talk to me, but I was sent a card that I just wanted to share because although it was written and sent to me, I believe it applies to all of you. And I just wanted to share it because I think it should be, you should all be receiving the same feedback. And it just, I won't read the whole thing, but just a little bit to you. It says, thank you for your service to our community, but especially right now. Please know that though we don't see you face to face, particularly right now, that our thoughts are with you for your wisdom and discernment to know best how to help our community in such a challenging and difficult time. I can only imagine the difficulties that are coming across your email or your desk related to this problem. But as a leader of smaller groups of people, I know how difficult and challenging it can be in these type of times. And so I just wanted to take an opportunity to, and I've been given a nudge to thank you for all of that you're doing, seen and unseen. It's greatly appreciated by all of us. And so I just wanted to share that with all of you because you all should hear it as well, not just for me, because I know you're all stepping up and doing a lot more than typical this time. So just wanted to share that with everybody. Thank you.
Mr. Preston.
Thanks, Mayor. Of course, like other colleagues here, want to talk about the pandemic, where we're at currently, and what the path forward looks like. My remarks will be short, but I just wanted to, first of all, express a sign of thank you to our residents, to our businesses, and to those in our community for their continued patience. Thank God the vast majority of Normal residents and those around the country and the world are still healthy, and those around them are still as well. And as the seasons change and as time goes on, it can be harder and harder to remain isolated, remain at home, and protect not only yourself, but perhaps even more importantly, protect others by not going out, and when doing so, practicing social distancing and wearing the mask. So thank you, and I ask that our residents continue to hang in there. I would also say that in light of that, the opportunity to speed the process up beyond the governor's originally proposed 4 regions around the state for reopening is something that I hope the governor does consider. I know that there's been a Heart of Illinois subregion put out that the proposal does include McLean County in it. That's something that I hope that the governor gives a serious look at, some consideration at, to where if we are able to safely open up on a quicker time frame, at least allowing the option in some way or another for that to come to fruition sooner than the larger region that the governor originally proposed for us is something that I think our businesses and our consumers, many of them would welcome. And again, I am totally with Mr. McCarthy and a number of others who have stated that certainly not every business will be comfortable opening up. Not every employee will be comfortable working. Not every consumer will be comfortable going out, even with safeguards and limitations on individuals allowed in a certain area. But creating an opportunity for there to be more than there is currently today is, I think, a step in the right direction. I hope that the governor gives that a lot of thought and ultimately allows a path like the Heart of Illinois subregion to move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Preston. I think just a quick comment on that, in the sense that I sent a letter to the governor asking him to give consideration to the Heart of Illinois plan. I thought it was a good plan. It's not a perfect plan. There are some things that probably could be tweaked in that. The city of Bloomington, Mayor Renner did the same thing. And I know McLean County rural mayors are taking this issue up with the same position that we're encouraging the governor and his staff to give serious consideration to subregion and looking at parts of the state differently than they are currently now. And the 4 regions, maybe 8 regions, I'm not sure how that stacks up. So we're pushing in that regard. I think everybody's clear from what I've heard that we're not going to do anything rogue and say we're not listening to the governor and we're just going to go ahead and do what we want to do anyway. We're trying to work with the governor to convince him that we should take a hard look at this. And Ms. Lorenz?
Hey, yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wanted to chime in, as the others are doing, with some food for thought on what's going on in my mind with regard to where we stand right now with reopening the economy, when, how is probably the biggest question. While some of you have quoted business journals, I'm going to wrap up with a quote of some lyrics from the late Tom Petty. So stay tuned for that. On this, I have become just so aware of the fact that there is no right or wrong answer. No matter what we decide to do as a municipality, as a county, as a region, there is no right answer. And why is that? Well, because we just don't know. We don't have data. It's a novel situation. It's a novel virus. We're grasping at data. For heaven's sakes, we're even grasping at assumptions, right? The modelers are building their models on assumptions, and even those assumptions are sometimes evolving and changing the models themselves. So there is no right or wrong answer. If we open too soon and there's a backlash of this, we're wrong. We don't open soon enough, we're wrong. We just don't know. We have no real past experience to go on for something like this, unless we're over 100 years old and lived through the last pandemic of this nature. So that's one thought that is clearly in my mind, that there is no right or wrong answer. The other is that it's not a binary choice. It's not like a seesaw where you're either open or you're closed. There's something that is more of a continuum of decisions that we have to make, not not a light switch, as I think a lot of people make the analogy. I think of it more as a seesaw. We're going to, and we've already begun to make a series of decisions, and we as a council will need to continue to make a series of decisions to work our way along that seesaw until we find that perfect balance, if we can get there on the fulcrum, between economic health and public health. I mean, that's really what kind of is at a trade-off here. I think the most recent example of where there was no right or wrong answer was in the decision a couple of weeks ago to say that the pools would not reopen. Devastated a lot of people. I'm sure you all heard, as I did, the pros and the cons for that. I guess I wanted to take a moment to make it clear to some who were not happy with that decision that it was as much of an economic decision for us as it was a public health one, and maybe even slightly more of an economic decision, because if we had opened the pools and spent the $1 million that you do to hire and run the pools, and then no one showed up, that's being a bad steward or a not ideal steward of taxpayer dollars. On the other hand, if we don't open, well, obviously, we know the feedback that we're getting on that. So, it's going to be a series of incremental of decisions. And so I'll wrap up with my reference to the Tom Petty song, Heart of the Matter. Verse 2, these times are so uncertain, there's a yearning undefined, and people filled with rage. We all need a little tenderness. And I think the rest of that song goes on to talk about forgiveness as well. So with that, I guess I would try to remind all of us and all of our residents to have a little tenderness and a little forgiveness with each other and with those of us who are making decisions, because they're not easy. There's no right or wrong answer. Thanks.
Ms. Reese, did you have a comment? You're on mute. Yeah.
Mayor. I did have a comment not directly related to this Illinois Heart of Illinois plan or reopening. So if council wants to finish up that topic, I can hold my comments. Okay. Somewhat related. I appreciate all of council's comments this evening. Very productive. It's very useful for staff to hear your comments about reopening and strategies and such, and our overarching need to build resilience and do what we can to get the organization and the community through this pandemic. But what I wanted to do is just take a moment, if council and mayor are okay with this, is to respond to one question that came up earlier in the council meeting. That's specifically directed to Mr. Nord's inquiry. On a couple of occasions, Mr. Nord has asked me about information relative to cultural arts advertising. I suppose in some way this does refer back to building resilience, but our advertising for cultural arts is important to the operation. And if it's okay with council, I would like Cultural Arts Director Beth Wisman to answer the inquiry that Mr. Nord has made on a couple of occasions about our spending of funds toward advertising for the Normal Theater and the Children's Museum. So if that's all right. Thank you, Beth.
Okay. Well, mostly what you're seeing is the remainder of the annual contracts from last year's media buy. Those are contracts with local businesses, and they do support local jobs, which is very important. But also, we've been working with our local media partners who understand the unusual situation, and they've been flexible and generous with some value-added spots. But we've also seen increased engagement because right now, of course, people are paying more attention to the news. And so we are actually seeing more outreach, and we actually think maybe it's more effective than ever right now. And also, we're marketing something that no other local theater can offer right now. The Normal Theater, we've adjusted our messaging to reflect the fact that we have exclusive film titles that are through distributors that we partner with. Some of those are contracts, and so we want to make sure that we respect those. But also, they're offering things that you cannot get anywhere else. So if you go through normaltheater.com and you watch these movies, when you're paying for those, we are receiving revenue. And other theaters in our community don't have an active revenue stream right now. So it behooves us to promote that fact and to advertise. Also, we have been talking about our Friends of the Normal Theater membership program that we've been upgrading over the last few months. So that's another thing to promote that has to do with revenue. That is to directly support the preservation of our historic building, which people absolutely love. So essentially, we're offering the public access to a town resource, even if the facility is closed. And so we need to communicate that, and we hope that we are effectively reaching the audience. And then there's the other side of just reminding people that the things that we love and we value in our community are still very much alive and are pivoting, just like small businesses are across the community. So we have a job to do, and we've cut costs, but we're not going to ignore an audience that could also bring in revenue. Now, I appreciate the questions. I think we had to ask those questions moving forward, and we won't sign new contracts moving forward until we have a better idea of what's to come. But because we have existing inventory, we're going to use it wisely.
Thank you. Ms. Smith.
I don't know if the plans are finalized, but I believe Ms. Reese had sent out some information about a ceremony on Memorial Day. And if there is more information to share about the plaque, I think the public should be aware of that. And also taking advantage of Memorial Day to a shout out to all of the persons who have served our country, and especially the National Guard volunteers that are at the testing site, but all of our veterans, including you, Mayor Coos and Ms. Reese.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Smith. I actually didn't print off the details. I believe it's 11 o'clock on Monday, Memorial Day. The Carl S. Martin American Legion Post is coordinating a dedication of a new plaque. The plaque will be installed at the base of the light pole in the gateway for the Mark Peterson Plaza, the area between the Children's Museum and Uptown Station here. And certainly we want to be respectful of social distancing, of gathering size, and we want to encourage safe practices. So this event is really coordinated by the American Legion. We are providing them with support, but again, we are trying to be respectful of gathering size and encouraging social distancing and masks and such. So I believe their plan is weather dependent, I'm sure, but I believe it's 11 a.m. on Monday morning, next week, Monday.
Thank you. Can I have a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Second. Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mayor Coos?
Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.